Mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, as most of us have our dessert now, and coffee will be on your tables very soon, or tea, or whatever you like. And before too many of us are pressed into the schedules that we need to abide by in order to get our various modes of transportation under control, and that includes Dr. Stojak, who will be on a train very soon. We'd like to move ahead with the schedule today. Our speaker at lunchtime today, and I'll have a few concluding remarks, but I'd like to get right to Lucy's presentation. Marie-Lucie, and I'll read her bio for you. Marie-Lucie Stojak holds an undergraduate degree in law from Université de Montréal and a master's and doctorate degree in law from the Institute of Air and Space Law at McGill University. Her fields of interest include international space law, space commercialization, space and security, Earth observation data policy issues, intercultural negotiation, and interdisciplinary team building. She has over 20 years of experience in the development and management of international, interdisciplinary, and intercultural educational programs. From 1994 to 2000, she served as the first director of the Space Studies Program, a 9-week professional development program in the space field offered by the International Space University. She also served as co-chair of the Policy and Law Department at numerous Space Studies programs, which is the SSP acronym. She also served as co-chair of the Policy and Law Department at numerous SSPs, I repeat. She has been a member of the Canadian delegation to international organizations such as the United Nations, the European Union, and the Conference on Disarmament. She is a faculty member of the International Space University and an elected member of the ISU Academic Council. She is a member of the group of experts of the annual Space Security Index. Since 2017, Lucy is the executive director of Mosaic, which is the creativity and innovation hub of Hautes Études Commerciales in Montréal. She continues to direct Mosaic Summer School on management of creativity and innovation. The program is designed to compare creative practices from diverse fields, ranging from industry and arts to science, to better understand the creative process and its management, and to discover management tools to facilitate innovation in business. She currently serves as the chair of the Space Advisory Board, which brings us to Lucy today. Lucy, if you please, come on up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoff, for those kind introductory words. Thank you to Casi for honoring the Space Advisory Board with this opportunity to provide you with an update and maybe talk a little bit about the future road ahead of us. Merci aussi en particulier à Jacques Giroux, qui est maintenant le président du Casi et de Astro 2018 et probablement peut-être le seul citoyen de la ville de Québec qui est ici dans la salle avec nous. Donc un grand merci aussi d'avoir pensé au Space Advisory Board, au Conseil consultatif sur l'espace pour nous insérer dans cette très belle conférence qui, si j'ai bien compris, a été un très grand succès. I'm really delighted to see a lot of familiar faces. Many of you contributed to the SAB journey over the past year. I'm delighted that you are back, and thank you very much for your contributions, and we hope that you will continue supporting the SAB. I'm also extremely pleased, and this is from a personal perspective, not with an SAB chair hat on, very pleased to see so many ISU alumni present over here. It's like a trip through memory lane, seeing that the investments that were made in the late 80s, early 90s to invest in education and interdisciplinary space education has now 15, 20 years later really led to the advancement of Canadian talent in many institutions at the CSA and industry, and new companies were developed thanks to some of the alumni, and that really, really makes me extremely happy. So that is a personal note. So the Space Advisory Board, as you know, was mandated back in April 2017, so it's been almost a year day to day. In fact, exactly a year ago today, we were, I think, in Toronto at one of our roundtables. So in April 2017, the Honourable Minister Navdeep Bains reinvigorated the Space Advisory Board and asked us to take on as a mandate, or tasked us to carry out some outreach activities and conduct consultations to help the government develop a space strategy for Canada. He encouraged us along the lines of the Innovations and Skill Plan to encourage a growing space sector, to certainly continue attracting talent, to inspire Canadians, to contribute to scientific advancement of emerging technologies, and to support companies to scale up, as I mentioned, has been highlighted numerous times in the recent Innovation and Skills Plan. So who are we? We, as a reminder, are still here. We are a board comprised of 11 members with very various backgrounds, ranging from law to scientists. We have CEOs, members of academia, professors, consultants, and we feel that this diversity of perspectives is something that is a strength of the Space Advisory Board as we traveled through our journey of the roundtables and came up with our report. So we held 7 roundtables in total, in person, 2 that were carried out by webinar. These were very well received. They were attended by over 180, maybe closer to 200 individuals. We received numerous written submissions, at least 70 written submissions, to feed into the process of providing input on the development of a space strategy. One thing that struck us was the enthusiasm, the passion, the knowledge, the dedication of all of those who did attend the different roundtables and contributed to this effort. And there was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm and optimism and desire to contribute and to move the space sector forward. Many new ideas came up, many great suggestions were made. We could not, in the time frame that we had to deliver our report, address them, but clearly one of the future roles of the SAB certainly could be to reinvigorate and keep reminding and bringing up some of the great suggestions and ideas that were brought up during the roundtable. So we then delivered our report entitled Consultations on Canada's Future in Space, What We Heard, to Minister Bains, as requested in the early part of the month of June, and our report was released publicly in August 2017. We made one main recommendation in terms of how to move the space agenda forward, which was to designate space as a national strategic asset. This, as a reminder, was also based on 6 broad themes that I'm going to highlight very briefly with the slides. But basically designating space as a national strategic asset for the SAB, based on what we heard, would be a way to focus the importance of space. With the whole of government approach was seen as a key element in advancing space in Canada. The regulatory and procurement environment in terms of invigoration and updating was another important factor, and certainly to be able to attract talent, continue to inspire and attract young Canadians into STEM fields. So just very quickly to highlight some of the things that we heard, why designating space as a national strategic asset was so important. Clearly, Canada has a unique position in the world in terms of its geography. Space provides unification of the country. It provides essential services. It enables connectivity. It provides data that allows government to fulfill key needs for Canada, surveillance, security, environment management, issues that are all well known to you. It's therefore strategic because it's often the only capability that allows to address these issues. It's really part of Canada's infrastructure, and so we strongly heard across our roundtables and across the country that designating space as a strategic asset would ensure that this infrastructure aspect, this embeddedness of space, not only in government needs to deliver on services to Canada and provide a high quality of life to its citizens, but also embedded into the social fabric and highlighting these socio-economic benefits to the Canadian citizens would become clearer if the government at the highest level would designate space as a national strategic asset. It was also highlighted in our report that other countries have done so. Certainly many countries in the G7 have done so, and so it seemed a natural progression for Canada to designate space as a national strategic asset, The international nature also of space and the increasing availability of data in terms of having this as a strategic asset was also heard throughout our roundtables. The international aspects seem to be important to highlight again in terms of developing Canadian technologies. It's often through partnerships that Canada is able to advance its technologies, its capabilities, and to attract talent. And in terms of data, I was only able to attend this morning's panel that was led amongst others by Kevin Whale and Catherine, and this aspect of data and integrating and using space data with other data sets seems to also be something increasingly in the future that will become important to protect as a capability for Canada in providing services and needs to its citizens. The second theme that was heard and that helped us develop our recommendations in terms of declaring space as a national strategic asset was increasing Canadian capability. We repeatedly heard across the country that there was a talent drain, that there were insufficient opportunities for Canadian scientists, for young Canadian entrepreneurs to gain experience here, to get funding, to ensure their future in terms of, especially for the scientists, in terms of having missions that they knew would be in the pipeline, that they could invest their time in and know that in the long run they would continue having a job. So the capability or the capacity building was seen in terms of the skills, the workforce, the need to reinvigorate and stop the bleeding, basically is one of the words that was repeatedly heard in the roundtables. It was a means to attract better corporate investment and decrying this lack of financial stability in terms of investment, indicating that for some Canadian companies, especially startups and SMEs, that there was increasingly a greater opportunity to obtain funding from offshore sources than here within Canada. So some of the means or key proposals in order to address this particular challenge were to foster better international cooperation and partnership to support the development and the growth of the industry, and also to perhaps use procurement as a leverage to facilitate access to companies here in Canada to access funding. Providing flight opportunities also was one of the key capability aspects that needed to be brought back up to speed in Canada if we were to remain competitive with what other countries were doing in the space sector. Adopting new policies and regulations to capitalize on technological advancements. Again, this basically addressed the new space phenomenon, the fact that other countries were rapidly and aggressively adopting legislation. We heard that the regulatory regime required some updating, that waiting times to obtain licenses were quite long. To place emphasis on downstream activities also seemed to be important. And this possibility of also encouraging the Canadian government and different departments to actually buy services from industry rather than procuring and operating space systems. And so the idea of the government serving as an anchor tenant so that the private sector could better position itself both here but also internationally in terms of credibility and sort of rubber stamping of Canada in terms of the success stories of its own industry. So again, adopting new policies and regulations would be a means to address this particular concern and help advance the space sector. Continuity of policies and sustainable funding One of the things that we heard systematically also, and this is nothing new to those of you in this room, that space is complex, space requires, space missions are long-term investments, and so having a stable and sustained and regular cadence of missions, a flagship mission, smaller missions, medium-sized missions to allow technology development, to allow universities to develop technologies that could then be benchmarked, brought up to commercialization, and then scaled up. All of these factors seemed to be extremely important to all of the stakeholders that we heard. So the balance in vision, the balance in programs, the balance in categories also of missions, diversification between Earth observation, exploration, seemed to be something that was key so that you would be able to plan a long-term program. If you were a university researcher, if you were someone in industry, you would be able to have a long-term sustained program with obviously the funding to back that program and that cadence of missions. Outreach and education programs to inspire and prepare Canadians. Clearly, this was one of the resounding points that was made by all participants in the roundtables. To be able to have the skilled workforce will require continued outreach activities, sensitizing the Canadian public to the importance of space, making the case for space in a way that connects with each citizen and makes each person understand what the impact of investment in space brings to them and to their family. Education, again, not only in the space field is there a space drain, but education in terms of future needs. When I was speaking about artificial intelligence and the need to merge data sets from space with other data sets, we heard consistently that this is going to require new skills, a new workforce, and so investing in that long-term continuity to ensure that there's a pipeline of skilled workers to maintain the space program, to reinvigorate or bring back funding to the Canadian Space Agency was also seen as one of the key elements. And again, maybe to, on a personal note, to drive the point on the importance of continuity, investing in education is also, just as industry and academia have called for a stable, sustained, funded, long-term program to invest in, education should have the same approach. And the proof really is the point that I made earlier about the different ISU alumni who have come through the system over the past 20 years, who had the investment and were able to capitalize. And so that means that there was a vision 20, 25 years ago to invest in this kind of education and outreach. And last but certainly not least was the urgent call to action. Many of you actually who are here in the room and who attended the roundtables or who submitted papers said we're glad that the Space Advisory Board was reinvigorated. We're pleased to provide you with feedback. We contributed to the Emerson report back in 2012. We really hope and want you to underline that this, for many of us, seems to be a last chance. We have, the industry does not have guidance. There's no plan. We're losing opportunities. We're not in a position to accept invitations to participate in international programs. So there is a very urgent need to act now. So this was clearly the strongest leitmotif throughout our findings. Just to quickly give you a sample also of following the release of the report in August 2017, we continued to engage and do outreach activities as we were tasked to do. We participated in the Aerospace Industries Association of Canada's Space Day on the Hill. That was an extremely successful event. We were able to meet with Minister Baines. We met also with the CSA President Laporte. More importantly, we met with members of Parliament and others not involved in the space field to continue underlying the importance and the insights of our recommendations and of what we heard during the consultative process. We participated in conferences, the CSA conference. Interestingly enough, the CSA hosted a conference in November that was not per se 100% dedicated to space, but that involved the healthcare system, the idea being to try and get the space sector and another sector where space clearly could have an impact to speak to each other, to see how the different technologies being currently developed for the astronaut long duration flights, how could that be spin-off back here onto terrestrial applications, and vice versa. What kind of research and technology exists in the medical field that maybe could be useful for space. So again, we were optimistic. We did numerous individual outreach activities, community outreach activities, blogs, newspaper articles. And when we were in Toronto around mid-February for the SmallSat conference, I think that that was the day that the announcement was made that the budget would be declared on the 28th of February. And so on the 28th of February, budget 2018 did come out. There's no doubt that there was, on the part of the Space Advisory Board, that there was disappointment that space had not been signaled out in the 2018 budget. There was a message that was made on behalf of the Space Advisory Board, which basically said that the board undertook the analysis that the board undertook of the sector, and our report pointed to the need for an urgent action to reverse the decline in Canada's space capability. We were hoping the government would signal specific measures to advance long-term plans and priorities for Canada in space. Nevertheless, and this is maybe the first really important message, the Space Advisory Board remains engaged and optimistic that we will have a space strategy, and we will continue to work actively not only with you but with the minister to continue supporting the development and continue making the message that there's a need for a long-term space strategy and continue to support as best as we can. So yes, there was disappointment. We were able to arrange an in-person meeting in mid-March in Ottawa. You have to understand that being a group of 11 individuals that are spread out throughout Canada, trying to orchestrate a meeting where everyone can make it on the same day to Ottawa is not necessarily the easiest of tasks, but we were able to gather that support and meet in mid-March on the 15th to basically go over with representatives of ISED. We met also with representatives of the CSA, with senior policy staff of Minister Baines' office, and we also had the opportunity to discuss with Deputy Minister Nubley what the budget really meant for the space sector, why perhaps fundamentally we had three preoccupations when we walked into the meeting. One, and you could understand this, would be, well, what is the future role of the SAB? And what is the future in terms of priority of space for Minister Baines and for ISED? And so to this, we got a clear response from the senior staff that was present, and from ISED, from the Deputy Minister as well, that space remains a priority. Space remains a priority for Minister Baines. Space strategy and a space plan remains a priority, and that the Space Advisory Board remains vital to the Minister in pushing forward the agenda of space in Canada. So that was a signal to us that we could rethink our position, go over what we had done, and certainly try and regroup and come up with a plan to move forward during the upcoming months. We also noted that the budget did include, one of the things that was discussed at the meeting was why wasn't space funded? I think there was a lot of optimism amongst the Space Advisory Board members that, you know, it's been a long time and a lot of work has been done. We worked quickly. Our report seemed to have been well received. Many others. This is a collaborative effort. The Space Advisory Board is one vehicle to try and advance space within Canada, but all of you around the table contributed to that and continue to do so. So it very much remains a collaborative effort. So why wasn't it funded? And really the resounding response was, well, the government has conflicting and competing priorities. The purse strings are limited, requests are numerous, and in any given budget, there will be those requests that get accepted and those not for lack of merit or importance that will not get funded in a given budget year. And so the response really was one of priorities of that this year, that the priority was not for a designated space strategy plan and funding to accompany the implementation of a plan that could have been declared. You will have also noted that in the budget there are a couple of announcements of funding that are relevant to space. Of course, there's the $100 million under the Strategic Innovation Fund with a particular focus on LEO. There's also monies that were made available for reform focused on making the Canadian regulatory system more agile. So again, this is perhaps a point that's worth underlying. We, the Space Advisory Board, has really consistently told individuals at ISED, told the minister as well, that an important signal also could be incremental. And because one of the recommendations of our report deals with regulatory reform and adapting regulations, the fact that there are monies that have been highlighted to address that issue, even if they're not earmarked for space, could potentially be a signal if some of the regulations that do apply to the space sector were reviewed and adapted. So again, this is simply one way of signaling, although it's incremental, that there is seriousness addressed to the needs of the space sector and to some of the concerns that were raised in the report that we tabled earlier in the year. There are other initiatives also that you're familiar with, the Superclusters, the Innovation and Skills Plan. But again, these certainly can benefit the space sector, can benefit certain researchers and companies. There's still some uncertainty. For example, one of the questions we raised when we did meet back in March was the Supercluster initiatives. How will the space sector be able to get integrated or connected to some of the superclusters? If you look at some of the themes of the clusters, one deals with artificial intelligence, one is more geared towards manufacturing, one towards oceans. And when you look at the titles and the content of what they want to achieve, clearly space could be part of the solution of it that are being addressed by the superclusters. But who is going to play the role of connecting, and how can space leverage these opportunities that are presented in funds that have been recently announced and are of a more general application? The other point that we wanted to make was when we were in Ottawa that struck us was some of the key priorities that were highlighted in Budget 2018 included issues like Indigenous services. Science clearly was a clear winner in the last budget, as well as women in the workforce and equality, gender equality in the workforce. And from a Space Advisory Board's perspective, it seems that these priority areas can all clearly be supported by space technologies. You think of Indigenous services in terms of connectivity, in terms of bringing healthcare services, in terms of distance education. All of these can be provided thanks to space technology. The same holds true for women in the workforce. If you want to attract an increasing number of young Canadians and women in STEM impactful career paths, space can serve that purpose as well. And so connecting the dots in terms and the narrative of how space can help support government priorities and also mandates of different ministries and agencies within the department is an area where the Space Advisory Board feels it could also play a role in terms of better understanding of the importance of space to these kinds of issues. The other thing I want to point out and make very clearly to you, the point I wanted to make clearly to you, is the fact that the findings of our report still remain valid. what we heard and what we wrote is perhaps even truer today than when we first submitted it in August. Again, this was one report submitted in 2017, but there's been a consistency in terms of the message and in terms of the need for Canada to have a space plan and a space strategy since the Emerson report, even before, but in terms of writing, the Emerson report, the Euroconsult report came out, the IASC white paper was in the same direction. Research was done in certain institutions, for example, at Mosaic, HEC Montréal, which I'm involved with. A research project was carried out for the Canadian Space Agency a few years ago to try and highlight what is the economic return on the public investment of public monies in the space sector. And so the point being made that is that the Space Advisory Board simply continued reiterating a message that had been made before, and the urgency of action in terms of the Canadian government, in our perspective, has yet increased even more. The other point we want to try and continue making in terms of raising the awareness within government and within the public and with the public in general is to try and see what others are doing. If you look around, other countries are continuously increasing their funding to the space sector. You need only look at the United States, for example, that not long ago announced an increase of about $1 billion to NASA's budget. The European Commission released a press release in early May, I think, indicating that over the 5 years starting in 2020 or 2021, it wanted to increase investments in space by 25%. Other countries are also laying the groundwork to facilitate investment in space by regulations and policies. So you look at countries like Luxembourg, who enacted a space mining law back in August 2017. The UK recently enacted a Space Industry Act in March 2018. The US reinvigorated a Space Commercial Act. So all of these steps that are being taken aggressively being taken by countries who are, who foresee the potential of space and who want to get in at ground zero and who want to attract investment, they're laying the groundwork to facilitate commercial investments and research and attract the talent to their own constituencies. Another important factor where Canada can continue to play a role, and I regret not being able to have attended David Kendall's presentation on global governance, but if you read the European Union's space strategy, the fourth bullet in how they want to project themselves and what is important for Europe in terms of a long-term space strategy is to develop the global framework and the norms within which Europe can continue to have a sustainable and equitable access to space. And so I noted in this morning's presentation by Kevin Whale that this aspect also of norms and regulations in terms of advancing the space sector, and where Canada has tremendous strengths and could contribute, should continue to be a priority for the Canadian government. And last but not least, you need only also look at how many new countries of all sizes are investing in space, in their own indigenous space technology, primarily, I would argue, to have indigenous access either to SATCOMs or to data to provide essential needs for their own citizens and for their own country. So this cadence of activities that's happening around the world really should also continue to resonate here in Canada and continue to press on this last bullet that we made about the urgent need for action here in Canada. Moving forward, this slide may appear a little bit flat. It's an interesting position to be in right now. Our next Space Advisory Board meeting is at the end of the month of May, on May 31st, where we will gather. And the main objective of this meeting is to really set out a roadmap as to how we can continue to best support and advise the minister and to create a bigger groundswell and to continue to make the point that there's a real need to have a Canadian space strategy. And so I know that words like conduct further public outreach, continue a dialogue may seem, again, a little bit flat, but let me try and put a little bit more flesh behind that. To do public outreach, I think one of the things that the Space Advisory Board also learned during its journey during the last year is that I don't think that we are currently in Canada doing a good job telling the space story. And so the narrative, I would argue, needs to be changed and embellished. When I was talking before in terms of resonating with the Canadian public and giving a direct impact to someone for them to understand how space can affect their family, their life, is, I think, an important way to advance the space cause forward, rather than saying that space technology supports GPS, space technology supports crop farming, etc., to bring it really on a much more personal level. And I would say that at the IASC Space Day on the Hill, there was a very simple leaflet that had icons that basically the gist of the message was, well, how have you used space today? And you had a logo with a phone. Have you used a cell phone? You had a cross for medical care. Did you go to the hospital? And again, in terms of, maybe it's because personally I am surrounded by people who teach management and marketing, being in a business school, that the message and that the way that the message is carried forward is extremely important. So when we meet at the end of the month of May, we want to establish a clear idea of what to do, because basically the process that or the time frame that we're now faced with, and the process to continue pushing forward to get space included in budget 2019 is similar to last year's. There's a work that needs to be done, serious work, consistent work, continuous work with many stakeholders, with your help. But then the getting something into the budget process starts sort of the tail end of the fall, early winter, and then the budgets are usually announced always in February and March, and there's a time frame where you can continue doing outreach, but it's entered what I would refer to as the government machinery. And so the time frame is short. We will gather again in May. We will send out a message to indicate a clearer path forward. But I guess the bottom line, and I wasn't here when Sylvain Laporte made his presentation, but I was told by several of you that Sylvain apparently started by saying that that we didn't get funding this time, but it doesn't mean that we should not continue, roll up our sleeves, and continue pushing the space agenda forward. And because I feel that it, and the SAB, on behalf of all of us, we feel that it truly is a collective effort, we'd like to continue hearing from you. And in fact, I would like to start today. If you have ideas or suggestions, they're always more than welcome. They're taken seriously, and we will continue the dialogue. We find that the Space Advisory Board, as this interdisciplinary and sort of neutral third-party perspective, can continue to assist and advise the minister and to play an important role in pushing the space agenda forward. But we certainly can't work in a vacuum, and we certainly hope to be able to continue to rely on your help and your ideas to push this forward. So I will stop with these general remarks, and I'll open up the floor to questions or to ideas, to suggestions. Okay.
Hello, my name is Chuck Black. I work for a commercial space blog. Very nice to be able to put a face to you. We've talked on the phone once in the past. I think it's important for me to say that I appreciate what you've done over the last year. I appreciate the issues you've brought to public attention. I think that's important, because I've sometimes said good things about the Space Advisory Board and sometimes bad things. However, when that is said and done, you talked about outreach. You used the word outreach 5, 6, 7 times. For me, there's always been a difference between outreach and advocacy. And advocacy is the sort of thing that causes questions to be asked in Parliament. And one of my favorite jokes is how anybody who works for the Canadian Space Agency or wants to work for the Canadian Space Agency, they work for a man whose primary role is making sure no questions are asked about his agency in Parliament. So I'm going to ask you this question. When does outreach end and advocacy begin?
I think, thank you, Chuck. It is nice to put a face also to the name. Thanks for the question. Again, we're meeting in 2 weeks. Okay. We, I think, need to be more proactive in terms of advancing the space agenda. Certainly, when I was mentioning what are other countries doing, clearly what you can extract from that is a possibility of highlighting what the opportunities for Canada would be to invest and continue, and perhaps what some of the risks of not investing and not taking action might be. This might be a first step in terms of presenting new information to continue making the case for space. But I think all of the Space Advisory Board would agree that this is now phase 2 of our mandate. Our first phase really was a very clear mandate. It was do outreach, task, consult, please bring back findings and recommendations to help advise the minister on the drafting and creation of a space strategy. Now we're into phase 2. I started the presentation by saying it's a bit of an awkward time because, you know, if we were on June 1st, I would be able to report a little bit more clearly. But know that we feel and have a sense that more action needs to be taken. We need to regroup. We need to have a roadmap. We need to have a plan. And we'll keep you posted. And if you have ideas, they're always more than welcome.
Oh, I got more ideas than I got common sense. And I'm going to give up the microphone to Mark Boucher right now because he always asks a question after me.
So, Mark Boucher, Space Cube, if you don't know. So, I actually don't have a question. I have an idea.
Wonderful.
As my role as media, maybe it's not my place to say this, but I'll do it anyway. You mentioned leading into the next budget. One of the things the community could do, whether it's from an individual university or from a corporate perspective, and it is already being done occasionally by different industry groups, like the IASC does it, is we have the finance committee consultation that's coming up. Every summer, they put out a request for comments for the next budget. They usually frame it with, we want to answer these questions, but basically you can put whatever you want. And I would suggest that it's a very good opportunity to get ideas in front of the Finance Committee, and then and very importantly, follow it up with an actual appearance in front of the Finance Committee, because after you've submitted it, you can also say, can I appear in front of the Finance Committee, which is in the fall, September, October, November timeframe, and then that leads into the budget. So my perspective, using my old hat as a CSCA, is that there's not enough of that that's being done, and that the community really should try and do more in that respect.
Thank you. That's a very constructive idea. Thanks. I will pass that on the 31st. Another thing perhaps to raise is, as you know, and I'm sure that the CSA folks have mentioned the upcoming milestone events that Canada will have this year with the launch notably of David Saint-Jacques and RMC. When we hold our teleconferences, we always have representatives from the CSA, so we're informed of their communication plan and clearly trying to leverage these milestone activities and anchor some of the SAB outreach or education activities around these is also clearly something that we're going to look into to try and benefit from the momentum and continue to grow the groundswell. Okay. One last one.
Gordon.
Sure, I might as well. So I'm Gordon Sardi, I'm a guy. I just want to, so I guess it's not a question or a suggestion, but encouragement. And I see it's already started. The fact that the tri-councils have got more money, I think we should see that as an opportunity. They're more than willing to create collaborative programs. I see that's already started with CIHR. So I just want to encourage, keep that up and use that as an opportunity.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask a delicate question, and maybe I should know because I sit next to Jacques Giroux at the office. In this context of agencies always asking for more money and the government not necessarily having more money to spend and having maybe newer problems, is the scenario of resizing or reevaluating the size of the CSA to free up some more margin for missions? It seems the CSA as the strong machine to chunk out, phase zeros or concept studies to put out missions, and seems that the government has been reducing their budgets to the point where they still operate, but they can't get things out the pipe. So is this being discussed, or it's too delicate a subject that it can't?
I would answer by saying that certainly throughout the consultation process, there were different suggestions made in terms of modernizing or the CSA governance structure. And another point that was also clearly made throughout the roundtables was the need for the entire government to change the way it does business, not necessarily just with the space sector, but in general, and the need to modernize and to maybe change its mindset. So in terms of the CSA, clearly there were suggestions that were made. It's not, I would say, the purview of the SAB to make that kind of recommendation, but it has been certainly signaled and flagged to the minister that this continuous ability to fund, the fact that the funding has dropped significantly over the past years, the need, again, to be logical with the declaring space as a national strategic asset, the whole of government approach, the delivery, the cadence of missions requires stability in funding and requires a guarantee sustainable regular type of funding. And so in our recommendations, we certainly pushed for that. And in terms of restructuring of the CSA and perhaps even of other agencies that deal with space, that is really for the future. It's a valid point, not one that we've addressed directly right now.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask the thing as an engineer is I don't always often understand everything that government says. So you designated something called a national strategic asset. In government, critical infrastructure means something very particular, which basically means the government has to pay for it in some way. What does national strategic asset really mean? And is it basically code for this can be used to stop a sale against a foreign entity, against the Investment Canada Act?
When we put forward that recommendation of space being declared a national strategic asset, certainly we envisaged the idea that space is part of the infrastructure in Canada that's required for the government to provide services and needs and guarantee a good quality of life to its citizens. So it's strategic because it provides some capability that no other technology could have, and therefore should be highlighted as being strategic and something important for Canada to continue investing in and to continue looking at the interests of Canada in terms of that investment. Whether I know you mentioned a different terminology that I don't remember.
Critical infrastructure, it means a very particular thing in government. So I was just curious why it didn't hit that benchmark when you made the recommendation.
I think the fact that it was seen as the whole of government approach, the fact, I don't think that we did not use the word infrastructure in our report. If you read through the bullets of the need to have Canada continue investing in space and protecting it as a national strategic asset, we do mention the fact that it should be considered as part of Canadian infrastructure. Critical, I don't think we used the word critical, but for us the importance was to ensure that government did recognize that only space can provide certain capabilities, that those capabilities were essential for the government to provide services in terms of sovereignty, security, in terms of Canadian well-being, and for that reason, it should be clearly mentioned, as other countries have done, as the EU has declared space to be a strategic asset for Europe, worth investing in for the reasons that they've developed in their own policy and their own space plan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we're getting pretty close to 2 o'clock. Lucy, I think I'd like to thank you very much for
Thank you very much.
coming to speak with us today. It's an important way that Canadians can provide input into policy in Canada. And there's the email address. That's how to get in touch. And if we don't get in touch, we can't complain that nothing happens to change the situation. So as the message that has been repeated throughout this conference that I've heard has been underscored once again by Lucy, we need to get engaged in conveying the message. We need to be the messenger as much as any other body or person. So if we take this on as a personal initiative, it's probably the best thing we can all do to improve the situation. So thank you once again, Lucy. So we've come to pretty well the end of the conference. At 2 o'clock, that is to say in about 5 minutes from now, there will be some taxis outside that will be ready to take those of you who are going to ABB to ABB. Some will be cars. I think there'll be a couple of minivans. And once you're out there, you're on your own. So if you want to stick around for days, right. So we'll get you there by a cab, and then some of you will be going on to the airport. Others actually won't need a car or a cab, rather you'll be taking your own transportation. But in any event, once you're at ABB, you're, hate to put it roughly, but you'll be left to your own devices to get on from there. Now, Jacques, do you have something to add?
Just to make so the transportation to there is being covered. You don't need to worry about anything. If you want to come back or if you need any assistance for your transport afterwards, just let us know. We can help you out at ABB there. But pretty much you're on your own because it's very difficult to plan where each of you are going. So
right.
Yeah.
So my job now is to recognize some of the many moving parts that have made this whole assembly work the way it has this week. First of all and foremost, I'd like to thank Jacques for being the general chair of the conference. His guidance and his input and his resources have been critical to the success of this event. And in collaboration with Jacques as general chair are the technical committee co-chairs. I was just sitting with Mick, who is over there, Mick Faragalli, and Christian Lange, who's over on the other side there. So we have the private sector, we have government. Those two gentlemen have come together to lead a committee that was about 15 strong. And many of those people were session chairs, who also I'd like to thank very much, because part of their job is to solicit input, abstracts, to try and attract people to make presentations that you've had the opportunity to listen to. So thank you, all of the chairs, too many to mention by name right now. Thank you. Our volunteers, for future reference, and for those of you who benefited this time, as a student and a member of Casi, you get first dibs on volunteer positions to help us execute the conference. And in doing so, you sing for your supper. You're assigned a certain schedule to work, and in return for that, you're forgiven your registration fee. So I would encourage anybody who enviously was looking at other students who had this position for this conference to consider getting in touch with us sooner next time. And please, we can pretty well put to work as many volunteers as we get. So I hope folks will take advantage of that in the future. Our exhibitors and sponsors, of course, are critical to this event because that revenue makes it possible for us to be above the line rather than below the line when all is said and done. So I'm glad that the exhibits in this particular case were able to be put in close contact with all of you. And I hope the exhibitors were pleased with the result. I've spoken with some of them. And I would welcome any input from folks about how we can do a better job to provide value to exhibitors and sponsors of our events. You as delegates, it's all for you. But the more delegates we have, the more critical mass we have. And when you look around the room at all of the other people who are here with you, you're convinced that you're in the right place right now. And the bigger the group, the more convinced people tend to become. So our job is to try to increase the critical mass from year to year. And I'd encourage you, if you have the opportunity, to encourage your colleagues and your coworkers to consider the value that attending a Casi event like this represents, and maybe that'll help us to grow the numbers for the next time. Finally, just to look ahead, Casi has been encouraged by a number of different people and groups this week and previously to have a space event not just every second year, which is what Astro represents right now. And so I think Jacques and I and our strategic planning committee are moved to accept this argument, and we will definitely be working hard to have one or more additional space events in our own calendar, and we'll keep you all informed about what plans we have, and hopefully we'll benefit from your input about the shape and timing and scale of these new events that we'll be putting on that will cater to communities involved in the space arena in Canada. Finally, my heartfelt thanks once again to Jacques and ABB and his colleagues here in Quebec City for their support. And well, I guess until the next time we get together, and hopefully it will not be 2 years from now, it'll be a lot sooner than that. Safe travels and au revoir.